everyone, and welcome to another episode of Oppenheimer live streams. Today we are going to be looking at the 8th transcript in the Oppenheimer Security Hearings, continuing where we left off last time. Actually, give me a second to configure some things here. Just setting up the backup recording for the stream real quick in case my Wi-Fi goes out. Forgot to set that up. Let's see if I can do that. Okay, cool. All right. So yeah, today we are going to be looking at the 8th transcript, and yeah, as always, the way that this works is that the face that I show on the bottom right is supposed to be the person that's talking in the hearing, and the people on the bottom left are the people in the room. And if you have any questions for me about, the history and stuff like that, leave it in the chat and I can respond, or you can leave it in the comments below if you're watching this on playback. All right, so yeah, I have chat open on my phone, so I will be paying attention to that. All right, so let's just get started here. Yeah, in other news, as I said last time, I am working on my book. I'm gonna publish it in about 5 months now, November 29th this year, and I'm very excited for it. It'll be on Amazon. But in the meantime, if you're interested in any of my other 3 books, you can get those on Amazon right now. Those links, I believe, are in the description of this video if you're interested. These are sci-fi books about people living in space. The next video is, or the next book is going to be about people living on Earth. It's going to be nearer term in the future, but it's going to be all about genetics, like GMOs and stuff like that, and gene therapy. And I've had a lot of fun writing it, and I think it should be pretty interesting. So if that sounds interesting to you, make sure to check that out once it is published. Okay, I'm also just rearranging the slides a little bit. Okay, so yeah, let's get started here. Okay, so we just had a brief recess. Dr. Rabi, do you wish to testify under oath? And so I should put Dr. Rabi in here. Certainly. Would you be good enough to raise your right hand? I must ask for your full name. Isidor Isaac Rabi. Isidor Isaac Rabi, do you swear that the testimony you are to give the board shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Whereupon Isidor Isaac Rabi was called as a witness, and having been first duly sworn, was examined and testified as follows. Would you please be seated, sir? I must remind you of the existence of the perjury statutes. I am prepared to give you a description of the penalties if you wish, but may I assume you are generally familiar with the perjury statutes? I know what they are. Oh, I know that they are dire. That's pretty funny. I would also ask Dr. Rabi that you notify me in advance about the possible discussion or disclosure of any restricted data which you may get into or find necessary to get into during your testimony. I hope to have the help of Dr. Beckerly on that. Okay, that's interesting. I'm not sure if it's Berkeley. We had this problem last time. I'm not sure because it definitely says Beckerly right now. So I don't know which one's the typo when it says Berkeley or Beckerly, but I don't know. One of the two. Anyway, I'll just go with what it says whenever it says it, hopefully. I wonder if they're maybe they're two people and that's the twist. Anyway, okay. He's here and I'm sure will be alert. I'm confused about what has been declassified that I want technical professional help. Finally, I should point out to you that we regard the proceedings of this board as a matter confidential in nature between the Commission and its officials and Dr. Oppenheimer, his representatives, and witnesses. The Commission will make no public release of matters pertaining to these proceedings, and on behalf of the board, I make it a custom to express to the witness the hope that they may take the same attitude. Yes, sir. All right, then we have direct examination by Mr. Marks. So Garrison decided to take a break from speaking today. So we start with this guy. Okay. Dr. Rabi, what is your present occupation? I'm the Higgins Professor of Physics at Columbia University. What official positions do you have with the government? Let me see if I can add them all up. Just the most important. At present, as chairman of the General Advisory Committee, as successor to Dr. Oppenheimer, I'm a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee to ODM, which also is supposed to, in some way, advise the President of the United States. I'm a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee to the Ballistics Research Lab at Aberdeen Proving Ground. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees of Associated Universities Incorporated, which is responsible for the running of Brookhaven Laboratory. I'm a consultant to the Brookhaven National Laboratory. I was a member of the Project East River, but that is over. I was at one time the chairman of the Scientific Advisory Committee to the Policy Board of the Joint Research and Development Board, and a consultant there for a number of years. I'm a consultant to Project Lincoln. That is about all I can remember at the moment. That's enough. Speaking roughly, how much of your time do you devote to this official work? I added up what it amounted to last year, and it amounted to something like 120 working days. So you might ask, what time do you spend at Columbia? How long have you been a member of the General Advisory Committee? Since its inception. I don't remember the exact date of my appointment, but I have been to every meeting. I may have missed one since the first. When did you become chairman? I became acting chairman when Dr. Oppenheimer's term was out. By our own custom, the chairman is elected at the first meeting of the calendar year, and I was elected chairman by the committee at the first meeting, which I think was in January of last year. I'm not sure of the date of the meeting. Dr. Rabi, to what extent has your work as consultant in various capacities in the government overlapped or coincided with work that Dr. Oppenheimer was performing at the same time and in the same general field? Chiefly, of course, the General Advisory Committee, and also to a degree in Project Lincoln, and particularly the summer study of, I believe, 1952. Summer study where? This was a summer study at Cambridge on the question of continental defense of the United States. How long have you known Dr. Oppenheimer? I think we first met in the end of 1928, and we got to know one another well in the winter and spring of 1929. I've known him on and off since. We got together very frequently during the war years and since. And remember, this is in the movie. They meet in the Netherlands, I believe. Yeah, they meet on like a train in the Netherlands. So, yeah, in like 1928. Do you know him intimately? I think so, whatever the term may mean. I think I know him quite well. Dr. Rabi, if you will indulge me, I would like to skip around somewhat because, as nearly as possible, I would like to avoid too much repetition of things that have already been gone into by others. Will you describe the extent that you can what took place in the fall of 1949 insofar as the GAC was concerned, or you are concerned, in respect of the question of thermonuclear program for the Atomic Energy Commission? I can only give my own view and my own recollection. I have not prepared myself for this by studying the minutes. I intend to, but I am on in the morning rather than the afternoon, so I can give you just my own recollection. The thermonuclear reaction, or as it was called, the super, was under intense study from my very first contact with Los Alamos. When was that? About April 15th, 1943. At the establishment of the laboratory, Dr. Oppenheimer called together a group of people to discuss the policy and technical direction of the lab, and I was one of those who was invited to that discussion. All through the war years and following that was a subject of discussion and consideration by some of the very best minds in physics. The problem proved to be an extremely difficult, very recalcitrant problem because of the many factors which were involved, where the theory, the understanding of the thing, was inadequate. It was just a borderline. The more one looked at it, the tougher it looked. Following announcement of the Russian explosion of the A-bomb, I felt that somehow or other some answer must be made in some form to regain the lead which we had. There were two directions in which one could look. Either the realization of the super or an intensification of the effort on fission weapons to make very large ones, small ones, add, and so on, to get a large variety and very great military flexibility. Furthermore, a large increase in the production of the necessary raw materials, the fissionable materials, and so on, or one could consider both. There was a real question there where the weight of the effort should lie. When you say that this question that you are now describing began to become acute... When would you say that this question that you are now describing began to become acute in your thinking? Right away. You mean with the Russian explosion? As soon as I heard of the Russian explosion. I discussed it with some colleagues. I know I discussed it with Dr. Ernest Lawrence, with Louis Alvarez, and of course with the chairman of our committee, Dr. Oppenheimer. In fact, I discussed it with anybody who was cleared to discuss such matters because it was a very, very serious problem. That question then came up at the meeting of the General Advisory Committee. That would have been the meeting that began on October 29th, 1949. Yes. I do not recollect now whether this was the first meeting after the announcement of the Russian explosion or whether there was an intervening meeting. To refresh your recollection, Dr. Rabi, I think it has been in the record here that there was a regular meeting of the General Advisory Committee just after or just at the time when the Russian explosion was being evaluated. Yes, I recollect now. In fact, I was coming up on the airplane and there was Dr. Cockcroft, the director of Harwell. He didn't tell me what it was, but he said you will read something very interesting in the newspaper. You were coming on the airplane from where? From New York to Washington on the airplane. I ran into Dr. Cockcroft, and he told me I would read something very interesting in the noon paper. When I stepped off the plane, there was the star with his announcement, or with this announcement. This meeting, which you identified, was more or less contemporaneous by the official announcement of the government that there had been a Russian explosion. Was there any discussion at the time of the thermonuclear? I would have to refresh my memory on that. I cannot say. I would be astonished if there was not. I cannot say. I could go back and look. In fact, we talked about it at every meeting. In all events, the interval between that meeting and the one on the 29th was very much in your mind. Yes, sir. Do you have any recollection or impression as to the form in which the question of what to do about the thermonuclear problem came up in your meeting that began on October 29th? The way I recollect it now, without perusal of the minutes, in fact, I think we kept no minutes of that meeting, which is somewhat unfortunate under the present circumstances. The way I recollect, do you know why no minutes were kept? Because the discussion ranged so very widely. We were concerned during that period, as I remember, and we consulted with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We consulted with representatives of the State Department, and a whole lot of stuff was there which we didn't feel should be distributed around. We decided not to keep accurate minutes of the meeting. What was the question again? I asked you whether you had any recollection or any impression as to the form in which the question concerning the thermonuclear problem came before you. That is, the GAC at the meeting, which began on October 29, 1949. As I recollect it now, it is 5 years ago, the chairman, Dr. Oppenheimer, started very solemnly, and as I recall, we had to consider this question. The question came not whether we should make a thermonuclear weapon, but whether there should be a crash program. There were some people, and I myself was of that opinion for a time, who thought that the concentration on the crash program to go ahead with this was the answer to the Russian thermonuclear weapon. The question was, should it be a crash program, and a technical question? What possibilities lay in that? What would be the cost of initiating a crash program in terms of the strength of the U.S., because of the weakening of the effort on which something which we had in hand, namely the fission weapons and the uncompleted designs of different varieties, to have a really flexible weapon. The question of interchangeability of parts, all sorts of things which could be used in different military circumstances. Then there was the question of the military value of this weapon. One of the things which we talked about a great deal was that this weapon, as promised, which didn't exist and which we didn't know how to make, what sort of military weapon was it anyway? What sort of target it was good for? And what would be the general political effect? In other words, we felt, and I'm talking chiefly about myself, that this was not just a weapon, but by its very nature, if you attacked a target, it took in very much more. We felt it was really essential, and we discussed a great deal what were you buying if you got this thing. That was the general nature of the discussion. Technical, military, and the combination of military-political. Dr. Rabi, if in the state of mind that you have described, the question among others had been put to you by the Commission or its chairman to consider an appraisal of the then program of the Atomic Energy Commission, of whether it was adequate, and if not, what to do about it, what would you have considered a question in those general terms embraced? Are you referring specifically to the thermonuclear weapon or to the whole program? I'm referring to anything that you think of. Would that have embraced the thermonuclear? The thermonuclear weapon at Los Alamos went through ups and downs. We spent a lot of time talking of how we could get some very good theoretical physicists to go to Los Alamos and strengthen that effort. We thought at times of the effort as being such a distant thing that working on that kind of research, because it was a distant thing and new ideas would evolve and would really act as a ferment and sort of spark the laboratory. It was one of those things where you really didn't know how to find a way, where experiments were really difficult to make and tremendously expensive. With the ideas in hand, it was very hard to know how to go at this thing, even how to set up a crash program. But what we were concerned about, on the other hand, we felt that there was a very great inadequacy in the Commission's program with respect to the production process, the amounts of fissionable material, and the amounts of raw material which were being produced, that we were not spending enough money on that. We felt, almost from the very beginning, of an increase in Hanford. We made a technical recommendation at the time of how more could be gotten out of Hanford, about hastening the construction of certain chemical plants for the purification of the material. It was our feeling that the resultant controversy when the president ordered Savannah River, that the whole controversy was worth the thing. You are getting ahead of me. You asked such a broad question. I'm losing track of this. Just once more, to search your memory, and if you haven't got any, all you have to do is say so. Search your memory as to the form in which, the nature of the circumstances in which, there was before the General Advisory Committee in the capacity as such at the October 29, 1949 meeting. I'm sorry. At the October 29, 1949 meeting, the sense that you were appropriately considering the question of a crash program for the super. If you haven't got any memory, say so. The sense of whether we were considering a crash program for the super. Do you have any memory as to how that question was before you? Among lawyers, we say, how did the question come up in the case? You mean in detail how it came up? You mean who said what to whom, when? That I don't remember. I'm sure it was before us. You don't know who presented it? How it was presented, whether it was first presented with our preliminary meeting with the commissioners, whether it was first suggested by Dr. Oppenheimer and then confirmed in the preliminary meeting with the commissioners, and so on. I really don't remember. At other meetings, we have minutes, and all this would have been spelled out. Oh, I see we have chat. Let's see. So CDP says, hey, at Graviton Media, given the current situation, North Korea and Russia, and your knowledge of historical events, do you consider that a nuclear clash, Russia versus USA, is inevitable? That is interesting. Yeah, I have seen the pictures online of Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un meeting up. I'm not sure specifically what they are meeting up for, like that they weren't doing before. Like, I'm not sure, have they started collaborating on like a nuclear program, for instance? I'm not exactly sure what they're doing, but in terms of a nuclear clash between Russia and the USA inevitable, that's a tough question. I mean, I would say it's probably not inevitable, but basically every generation you're kind of rolling the dice. The problem is that you basically, like, any institution will eventually have like a crazy person take it over, right? So if you look at something like, you know, the kings of England for like 500 years, right? There were a bunch of them that were just like totally insane. Or like the Catholic Church for like 2,000 years. There were a few popes that like even today everyone's like, yeah, that pope was like insane and a bad guy, like even Catholics, right? So it's like, thank God that none of these institutions that existed for hundreds of years had nuclear weapons, because at some point someone would have taken them over and might have used them. And I think that there is a concern with Russia just being such an unstable country, that you might eventually get some political leader that is just kind of crazy enough to go ahead with something like that and just nuke things. In terms of Putin specifically, I mean, I don't know his psychology fully, but I tend to think that he wouldn't want to start a nuclear attack unless he got like incredibly desperate, because if you look at like the interviews that he does, like a lot of what he talks about is like Russian history and stuff like that, and how it's like he kind of wants to like restore the USSR and like get a bunch of like territory back, like reconquer a bunch of territory. And so it's like, if nuclear war were to break out, that would basically be the end of the world. It would be the end of both the US and Russia. And it's like, I don't think he wants to be remembered as the guy that destroyed Russia, essentially. Like, I think that he's like kind of concerned with like history and stuff like that, and he wants to be remembered as like, you know, one of like, who was it, like one of the Russian Tsars that were like something the Great. I forget what they were called, but like the people that like unified Russia in the first place and stuff like that. So like unless he was like totally boxed into a corner and like Russia had like lost a bunch of territory, like even just like the actual territory of Russia, like I don't know, if like somehow people were closing in on Moscow or something, then maybe he would be crazy enough to just kind of do it. Um but yeah, I mean, it is it is definitely, yeah, a complicated situation. I see the next chat. Appreciate your take on this complicated situation indeed. Yeah, it's definitely complicated. I think in terms of like solutions to the nuclear problem is that you essentially want the decision making on nuclear weapons, to like the use of them, to be as distributed as possible, which of course, I mean, that's not something that we can change. But if it's distributed to, say, like a committee or something of like 15 people rather than up to just one person, then it's like all of them have to go crazy at the same time, which is less likely. I guess that's how I kind of see it. I kind of see it like a game of dice almost, in that you're basically waiting for someone to go crazy. Of course, there are kind of like soft power, like practitioner veto style checks on these things. Like for example, if Putin like went crazy and decided to like give the order to launch all the nukes, I mean, it's incredibly likely that the generals would just not do it, because it's like they don't want to destroy the world either. So it's like you have some of these like kind of checks and balances in there, but it's all very haphazard in terms of what you would like to see. Yeah, CDP says, yesterday I was watching a documentary about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Scary. Yeah, exactly. And like there were times during the Cuban missile crisis where we were very close to full out nuclear war, but it was up to like a few generals or a few soldiers to just decide not to give the order, because they just didn't think it was wise. So yeah, I mean, yeah, it's just definitely a interesting situation. Like I feel like thankfully we haven't had as many close calls recently in like the last 30 years than we had before that. I feel like there were a lot more close calls in like the 60s and the 80s. But maybe it's just because those are still classified or something like that, the ones that are more recent and we don't know about it. But yeah, it is fascinating. Definitely, like, I think part of US policy is trying to keep the number of states with nuclear weapons to an absolute minimum. That was the policy in the 90s when the Soviet Union broke up, because each of the 14, well, maybe not all of the 14 countries that made up the Soviet Union, but at least some of them had nuclear weapons. Like Ukraine used to have nuclear weapons from the Soviet era, but the US was essentially convinced them to give up those weapons because they wanted to minimize the number of states with nuclear weapons. And that's what we're doing with Iran. I mean, now it's a controversial issue of like, there's like the Iran nuclear deal, but then like some people say it's not strong enough. But I don't even know. But I think it's a good thing to try to get Iran to stop developing nuclear weapons, definitely. I'm not sure how much we really can do that, because Iran does not really care that much what the US has to say about things. But yeah, I think we're still in the single digits in terms of the number of countries that have nukes right now. I think it's like 7 or 8, something like that. And obviously it's good to keep that to a minimum. But I guess another thing about like the modern nuclear situation that I think we should focus on more is developing more effective defense systems against nuclear weapons. So like missile systems that can shoot down nuclear weapons or something like that. because that's kind of the only thing that's within your control as a country. So, I mean, the U.S. has a lot of influence on the world stage, but like that only goes so far because there are so many rogue states, like, you know, Russia, North Korea, Iran, that will kind of just do what they want. I mean, even China, they'll just do what they want. They don't really care what the U.S. has to say about it. I mean, they care a little bit. Like you know, China hasn't invaded Taiwan, for instance, like mostly because of, I think, U.S. pushing back on that. Although also because Taiwan just militarily would be a hard country to invade. But but in terms of like being safe from nuclear weapons, I think what they would call in these hearing transcripts the Continental Defense Program. Nowadays, they have probably a bunch of different words for it. Um, I mean, I think at one point it was like when like Reagan was doing something with space lasers, they were calling it the Star Wars program and stuff like that. But I think defensive measures are a very good idea for the US to invest in because that is the most surefire way to keep the US safe. Because at the end of the day, like Russia is going to do what Russia's going to do, North Korea is going to do what North Korea is going to do. That is we have far less control over that than we do over our own defenses. Um, yeah. So I think it's kind of like, in terms of military history, it's kind of an arms race between creating a new effective weapon and creating an effective defense for that weapon. And what we need to do is really catch up to create an effective defense against nuclear weapons, because I don't think we really have that right now. So, yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, it's kind of funny. Part of that is like I think something interesting is that in the 50s they encouraged the creation of suburbs in order to deter a nuclear strike by deconcentrating industry from city centers, which is just kind of a natural way to like make nuclear weapons less effective. And I feel like today we might see something similar because of all of the remote work options that are suddenly available with like Zoom and stuff. And the fact that the US economy is so much of like a service-based kind of office job economy now, rather than like we don't do much in terms of industrial manufacturing anymore. So you could have like a second wave in terms of like, if the first wave was in the 50s of people spreading out from the cities, you could have a second wave of people spreading out that could also kind of softly deter a nuclear strike. Let's see. CDP asks, did it freeze? Oh, I think it may have froze for a moment. I apologize about that. Okay. Um, but yeah, just people might be spreading out more, um, and that might make nuclear weapons less effective. So, yeah. Anyway, I will continue reading in just a moment. All right. Okay. I really don't remember. At other meetings, we have minutes, and all this would have been spelled out. To the extent that you can tell it without getting into any classified material, what was the outcome of the GAC meeting of October 1949? I'll try to give it as best as I can. Let me break it down first. First, is it fair to say that the committee was in agreement with respect or essentially in agreement, with respect to the technical factors involved in the thermonuclear situation. It was hard to say whether there was an agreement or not because what we were talking about was such a vague thing, this object, that I think different people had different thoughts about it. You could just give a sort of horseback thing and say maybe something would come out in 5 years. It is that sort of thing. I know in my own case, I think I took the dimmest technical view of this, and there are others who were more optimistic. I think it has been indicated here that there was some statement in the report of the GAC at that time to the effect that it was the opinion that a concerted imaginative effort might produce that there was a 50-50 chance of success in 5 years. In the interest of accuracy, I think the report says a better than even chance. Let me check it to make sure. That is correct. Was that supposed to be a consensus of the views? More or less. When you are talking about something as vague as this particular thing, you say a 50-50 chance in 5 years, where you don't know the kind of physical factors and theory that goes into the problem. I just want to give my own impression that it was a field where we really did not know what we were talking about, except on the basis of general experience. We didn't even know whether this thing contradicted the laws of physics. You didn't know what? Whether it contradicted the laws of physics. In other words, it could have been altogether impossible. It could have been altogether impossible. The thing we were talking about. I want to be specific. I understand. We were talking within a certain definite framework of ideas. To the extent that you can describe them now, and confining yourself to that meeting, to the extent that you can describe them without trespassing on classified material, what were the recommendations of the GAC? They were complicated. We divided into 2 groups. No, there were some recommendations to which I think we all agreed, which were specific technical recommendations. Can you say what they had to do with in general terms? Certain improvements in weapons, the production of certain material which would be of great utility in weapons and which we felt at the time might be fundamental if a super were to be made. We recommend sharply a go-ahead on that. We recommend certain directions of weapons, and there was a third important recommendation which I don't recollect now, of a technical nature. You've spoken of a division. What had you reference to there? In addition to that, there were supplementary reports on which Dr. Fermi and I formed a minority, and the other 6 members present the majority. That had more to do with this sphere, where the political and the military impinge. One group felt, I don't like to speak for them because the record is there, but my impression was that this projected weapon was just no good as a weapon. You mean the particular weapon? I'm not talking from the technical, but the military opinion, that it was not of great military utility. The possible targets were very few in number, and so on. I could elaborate on that if I should be asked, but I'm speaking for somebody else, and there is a record. That was the group with which you did not join. Yes, of this specific design, Dr. Fermi and I, as I recollect it now, felt that in the first place, as far as we could see from the question of having a deliverable weapon, one did not gain a tremendous amount. Secondly, we felt that the whole discussion raised an opportunity for the President of the United States to make some political gesture which would be such that it would strengthen our moral position should we decide to go ahead with it. That our position should be such that, depending on the reaction, we would go ahead or not, whatever going ahead were to mean. Yeah, there was definitely an interesting, there was room for kind of a, what do you call it? Kind of like a bluff, where Truman or, the US government could have made an offer to Russia like, okay, let's control nuclear weapons. And even if Russia was probably going to say no, it would still make the US look better on the world stage. So Yeah, I don't know if I'm explaining that right. But basically, earlier in the transcripts, Oppenheimer was talking about how, like, he wished that instead of using the Russian A-bomb experiment as the catalyst for the US thermonuclear program, he was saying, I would have preferred if it was the catalyst of a international control program. Um, and I think what Rabi is kind of getting at here is that even if that wasn't the policy that Truman wanted, that probably was something that Truman should have made a gesture at doing and made an offer at doing, even if he knew that there's no way that the Russians would actually take him up on that, because it makes you look better. I think that's kind of a lot of, or I mean, I think it's a common enough tactic in international relations and like negotiations, is to make some sort of negotiating ask that seems like pretty reasonable to the world stage, but then you know that your adversaries are just not going to accept, because that makes you look more reasonable and makes your adversaries look more unreasonable, and that helps bolster your moral claim on the world stage. And I think that is pretty important. I mean, if you think about it in terms of like tactical moves, the Russians making an A bomb and then, you know, the US turning around and saying, well, we're going to make an even bigger bomb. I mean, it's not really convincing people. Like, it's not making a great case for your moral side of the argument on that. But yeah, so I think Robbie's probably right here. I think it would have been wise to do this kind of moral bluff, and say, oh yeah, let's totally do some international controls. Like, let's just get some independent, like, observers in to look at the Russian nuclear program. And the Russians would say no, because they do not like any independent foreign observers behind the Iron Curtain. So, yeah. Anyway. That our positions should be such that, depending on the reaction, we would go ahead or not, whatever going ahead were to mean. What made you think that it was appropriate for you to speak about these rather non-technical, but more political, diplomatic, and military considerations? That's a good question. However, somehow or other, we didn't feel it was inappropriate. In our whole dealing with the Commission, we very often, or most often, raised the questions to be discussed. In other words, we would say we want to discuss this and this thing. Would you please provide us with documents? Would you bring individuals to talk to us on this? And we would address the Commission on questions. On the other hand, we didn't feel badly if they didn't act on our suggestions. Sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't. So we did not feel that this was inappropriate. It would be very hard for me to tell you now why we thought it was appropriate, but we thought it so. After this meeting of the GAC, the outcome which you described, I might add to your feeling on this, the Joint Chiefs consented to come and talk to us, and gentlemen from the State Department came and talked to us. So we did not have the feeling all along that we were going far beyond our terms of reference. Otherwise, these people would not have showed up. If you can properly say so, Dr. Rabi, to what extent and in what way did the appearance of the Joint Chiefs or their representatives affect the course of your thinking and your expression of view? Oh dear, that is very hard to remember. I can only talk for myself. I don't want to talk for anybody. I had the sort of discouraged feeling that they were not very well briefed on the whole question of atomic weapons and their military utility. There was a very great pity. If they had been very well briefed on that, we would have been where we are now 3 or 4 years ago. 3 or 4 years what? 3 or 4 years ago. That is the general feeling I got out of it. Did the GAC have any responsibility for seeing to it that the Joint Chiefs were briefed? No, we did meet fairly frequently with the Military Liaison Committee. Is it fair to say that the GAC tried to keep the Military Liaison Committee fully informed? Our job was not to inform the Military Liaison Committee. Our job was definitely to talk to the AEC, and as we interpreted it, on the suggestion of the chairman of the AEC, at one time, to the president on some very special occasion. We have tried then and since not to be the servant of the MOC, or to work directly through them or the Joint Congressional Committee. Our job is to work with the AEC as specified in the law and possibly with the president. After the president announced the decision to go ahead with the hydrogen bomb on January of 1950, what attitude and what steps, if any, did the GAC take with respect to the subject from then on? I think we started talking about the best ways and means to do it. It was a very difficult question because here is a statement from the president to do something that nobody knew how to do. This was just a ball of wax. So we were really quite puzzled, except insofar as to try to get people to go and look at the problem. In that connection, did the GAC itself try to look into the problem? Insofar as we could, yes. We had people who were quite expert and actually worked on it. Chiefly, of course, Dr. Fermi, who went back to Los Alamos, Summers and so on, took a lot of time with it. So we had a very important expert right on the committee. Of course, Dr. Oppenheimer knew well the theoretical questions involved. Do you think the GAC had any usefulness in helping the work on this particular subject? I think it did. I think it had a great usefulness, some way indirect and some way direct, ways of trying to bring out the solid facts. It is awfully hard to get at those facts. I recall particularly one meeting. I think it was in the summer of 1950 at Los Alamos. I'm not sure of the dates, where we actually all got together. We got together all the knowledgeable people we could find. I think Dr. Betho was there and Fermi, to try to produce some kind of record which would tell us where we stood. This was before the greenhouse test. You mean what the state of the art was at the time? What the state of the art was and where do we go from here? How many of the laws of nature on the subject were available? What ideas and what technical information was available? We got this report, and it was circulated by the commission in various places because there was some kind of feeling that here the president is given the directive and somehow something is going to appear at the other end, and it was not appearing. If you can tell, Dr. Rabi, what was the connection or relation between the meeting you have just described at Los Alamos and another meeting that has been testified here, which took place, I believe, in 1951 in the late spring at Princeton? That was an entirely different meeting. At that meeting, we really got on the beam because a new invention had occurred. There we had a situation where you really could talk about it. You knew what to calculate and so on, and you were in the realm where you could apply scientific ideas which were not some extrapolation or very far beyond the known. This is something which could be calculated, which could be studied, and was an entirely different thing. Why did it take that long? Just the human mind. There was the president's directive in January 1950. Why it took this long? One had to get rid of the ideas that were and are probably no good. In other words, there has been all this newspaper stuff about delay. The subject which we discussed in the 1949 meeting, that particular thing, has never been made and probably never will be made, and we still don't know to this day whether something like that will function. This other thing was something quite different, a much more modest and more definite idea on which one could go. I interrupted you a while back when you displayed some enthusiasm with the Savannah River project. Would you try to fix in point of time when you intended that expression of enthusiasm? Just as soon as we got some more money to make more plants, which would make fissionable material, and really here was a policy of containment. When was that? I specifically was worried about the whole thing from 1947 on, when we started to get a tough policy with Russia with a minuscule stockpile, and if our bluff were called, what would we do? I felt all along, if we are going to have a tough policy, we have to have something to back it up. Did you and Dr. Oppenheimer disagree about that? No, oh no. We were worried sick about that particular situation. We were also worried about the situation that the military did not know the meaning of these weapons and somehow or other had a fixed idea that these necessarily were. They could not be made to realize or did not realize. There was some kind of breakdown in communication that all they had to do was to put the money on the line and order it, and this would come out. There were very many important military uses. So when the Savannah River project came along, when was that? The date of Savannah River, I can't recall. That would have been sometime in 1950. I don't know. I can't put a date on it, but it was extremely welcome. You say that you began to experience these worries about talking tough and not having a big stick in 1947. Did the GAC try to do anything about that, or did you feel you had any responsibility to do something about it? Yes, we did talk to the commission about it, I think. I'm not quite sure we did. I think at our first or second meeting, whether it is in the record or not, or in the minutes, I'm not sure. I know I myself kept on saying what we have to do is to quintuple Hanford. I'm quite sure that that would have been unanimous in the committee. Also, there were certain technical devices to increase the production, and we pressed on that. There was a very long delay just because of conservatism and a new contractor and so on in doing some of these things. But the pressure of the GAC all along. When you say all along, what do you mean? 1947, 48, 49? At almost every meeting. Through all of those years? That's right. Increased production of both fissionable material and of raw material, and particularly we kept on recommending a facility for the production of neutrons, which we knew would be very useful in some way or other, without particularly specifying where the use would come. Was Savannah River regarded by you as one of the great answers to that need which you have just described? Oh yes, I regard Savannah River as the way we answered the Russian success. I don't know whether you said earlier what Dr. Oppenheimer's view was about that. I'm quite sure that he was never in disagreement with that. Was never in disagreement? Yes. Did he evidence your enthusiasm? I think so. He's not the same enthusiastic fellow as I am, but I was quite sure he believed that it was a correct step. Dr. Rabi, there has been some questioning and some talk by other witnesses about a subject which is somewhat obscure to me, but perhaps if I just identify it, you may be able to say something about it. Namely, the question of a so-called second lab. Is there anything that you can say properly on that subject? I'll try and let Dr. Beckerly watch me on it. Maybe you better consult with Dr. Beckerly first. That question came up again and again. Los Alamos is an awkward place and so on, and various people kept on saying, "May I interrupt you, Dr. Rabi? When the term second laboratory is used, is it fair for me to assume that what is being talked about is the second laboratory which will have something to do primarily with weapons?" That's what I'm talking about. I'm just giving you my recollection of a whole series of discussions which came up from time to time. That competition is good. Los Alamos has been criticized for being too conservative and stodgy. The suggestion that some other group utilizing talent which for some reason or another was unobtainable at Los Alamos would be a good thing. I myself, I may say, was not in favor of that, and my own reason was, and I think Dr. Oppenheimer shared this reason, at least in part, that Los Alamos was a miracle of a lab. If you had looked at the dope sheet of the people that were there, you would not have expected in 1945 that it would just be a tremendously successful lab and of such a very high morale. It was really a terrific laboratory, just a miracle of a place. As a result of establishing another lab, I was afraid that it would be taken as at Los Alamos as a criticism and taking chances of spoiling morale. Those labs, as I think Dr. Morgan will know, or Mr. Morgan will know, largely depend upon the few key people. If you are to lose them, you have lost the lab. So my own feeling was, they are doing remarkably well, and why upset the apple cart? There was a possibility also that they would lose some personnel in a sort of general division. Finally, it occurred out in the expansion of the activities, finally, it turned out in the expansion of the activities of Los Alamos, these various tests and so on, that they used a lot of the contractors all over the place. They do a tremendous amount of subcontracting all over the place. All over the place? All over the United States. One very good group in instrumentation was developed at Berkeley by Dr. York. Then there was an additional circumstance that some important contract on a subject, which I won't even enter, was canceled there, and personnel became available, and I think it was a suggestion of the GAC that that group should be combined and another laboratory made, whose chief terms of reference would be in the realm of instrumentation for the study of explosions. Subsequently, and I think not on the direct recommendation, although I'm not sure about the record, but this is my recollection, the terms of reference of that lab were expanded, so that it became an actual second weapons lab. I think in popular opinion, such as Time magazine and so on, it's the lab which produced the thermonuclear weapon. That is a lie. That is what, Doctor? That's a lie. Do you mean by that to say that what has been produced came out of Los Alamos? Yes, sir. There has been a good deal, I think, of official information about the present strength of the United States in relation to nuclear weapons, fission and fusion. Is that, in your opinion, the result of work at Los Alamos? Yes, it's my unqualified opinion. And not the second laboratory. Not the second laboratory. The second lab has done very good work on instrumentation. There's also been some talk as a result of questioning in these proceedings about the question of continental defense. Is there anything that you can say properly about that subject, about your attitude on it, and about Dr. Oppenheimer? I can suggest the motivation, and I think Dr. Oppenheimer and I agreed. It is threefold. 1, we think that to protect the lives of Americans is worth anybody's while. 2, that one is in a stronger position in a war if one is fighting from a protected citadel, rather than just being open and just a slugging match with no defense guard put up. Thirdly, and it's more political, that the existence of such a defense system would make us less liable to intimidation and blackmail. Behind this were some brand new ideas, at least new to me, which came from some individuals in Cambridge, particularly Dr. Zacharias, which made such a defense line possible at a reasonable cost. Who's Dr. Zacharias? Dr. Zacharias is a professor of physics at MIT. He is the head of their division of nuclear science. During the war, he was at the radiation lab at MIT on radar. He spent a certain amount of time at Los Alamos. He was the head of the Hartwell Project, summer study for the Navy, which had a large effect on naval policy, on anti-submarine warfare, and things of that sort. Are you sure you're not mistaken about the Hartwell business? Zacharias was the head of the Hartwell study. Then also he ran the summer study. When you speak of the summer study, you mean the one that is popularly called Project Lincoln. No, Project Lincoln is a big project and laboratory which exists. The summer study was a special group brought together for a limited period of time of experts in different fields to look into the technical military questions of the possibilities of the defense of the United States. Were you and Dr. Oppenheimer concerned at all with that? I think we each spent a week or so at the beginning and a week or so at the end of this. We were not actually members of the working party. You were consultants. Consultants. Does the attitude that you have described on the subject of continental defense mean that you are opposed to a powerful strategic air policy? As far as I'm concerned, I certainly am not. Am not what? Opposed to it. I am very much in favor of it. I would like to see it more effective than it is, and I also would like to see its bases better protected than they are. Okay, sorry. Are the two things compatible, the continental defense you are talking about and the strategic? Absolutely. These are the two arms. One is the punching arm and the other is the guard. You have to have both, in my opinion. Do you know whether Dr. Oppenheimer's views are materially different than yours on the subject? I don't think they are. I think his emphasis might be somewhat different. I don't think the views are different. I think the emphasis might be different. In what way? Now we are getting into things which I would prefer not to answer. Why? Because it comes into questions of actual strategy and tactics of which we have special knowledge, and I don't want to go into any details of that sort. Alright, just so that I will understand what you are saying, I take it that you strongly favor, and to your knowledge Oppenheimer strongly favors, a powerful strategic air policy. Yes. And that you also favor an effective continental defense. That is right. And that you regard the two things as not incompatible. No, I think they are just absolutely complementary. They both have to be there. To put it in a word, a strategic air arm, unless you are going to prevent a war, is a psychological weapon, a deterrent. But the other fellow may not be the same, and you have to have some kind of defense before he does you irreparable damage. And furthermore, your plans may not go as you expect. They may miscarry. Unless you have a defense, you are not getting another chance. Let me interrupt for a moment to ask you, how much longer do you think your direct will take? Just two more questions, if you would rather... No, proceed. Doctor, it can be gathered from the nature of these proceedings that this board has the function of advising the Commission with respect to a determination that the Commission must make on whether permitting Dr. Oppenheimer to have access to restricted data will not endanger the common defense and security. In formulating this advice, the considerations suggested by the Atomic Energy Act to be taken into account are the character, associations, and loyalty of the individual concerned. Do you feel that you know Dr. Oppenheimer well enough to comment on the bearing of his character, loyalty, and associations on this issue? I think Dr. Oppenheimer is a man of upstanding character, that he is a loyal individual, not only to the United States, which of course goes without saying in my mind, but also to his friends and his organizations, to which he is attached, let us say, to the institutions and work, very hard for his loyalties, an upright character, very thoughtful, sensitive feeling in that respect. With regard to the question of association, I might say that I have seen the brief form of what would you call it, the report of Dr. Oppenheimer. What is that? It is some document about 40 pages, which is a summary. When did you see it? Sometime in January. How did you happen to see it? The chairman of the commission asked me to take a look at it. What year? What year? This year. I would say that in spite of the associations in there, I do not believe that Dr. Oppenheimer is a security risk, and that these associations in the past should bar him from access to security information for the Atomic Energy Commission. The report you speak of, is that an amplification of the letter of allegations or derogatory information which you have read of General Nichols to Dr. Oppenheimer? I don't know whether it was made as an amplification. I'm just trying to get some sense of what it is. I don't know. I understood it to be a digest of a very big file. I didn't understand clearly, Dr. Rabi. You used the phrase bar him. Would you mind repeating what you had in mind? I will put it this way. if I had to make the determination after having read this and knowing Dr. Oppenheimer for all these years, I would know him. I would have continued him in his position as consultant to the Atomic Energy Commission, which he was before. That's all. Are you ready to proceed with the examination? Mr. Chairman, it is now 1:15. I'm going to take 45 minutes anyway, and of course we have none of the associations in there. I do not believe that Dr. Oppenheimer is a security risk, and that these associations in... Oh wait, this is interesting. 1523. Oh, a page is repeated twice. Okay, that's strange. Mr. Chairman, it is now 1:15. I am going to take 45 minutes anyway, and of course we have no lunch. I would much prefer to take a brief break to get a cup of coffee and a sandwich before proceeding. Then there's discussion off the record. We will now recess until 2 o'clock. Mr. Chairman, is there any more news about the schedule for next week? You said the board might be calling witnesses and would let us know what you have decided. I'm afraid we will have to talk about that some at lunch, because I don't have anything new at the moment. Thereupon, at 1:05, a recess was taken until 2 p.m. the same day. So that's, just more interesting stuff. So now we're going to get into the cross-examination of Dr. Rabi. But yeah, it looks like Dr. Rabi had kind of the same opinion that I was stating earlier, which is that you really need to have like a physical defense system. You can't just rely on the idea of mutually assured destruction, because there are a lot of crazy people around. There's... I don't know if it's a quote or if I'm just paraphrasing things, but there's this idea that it's very hard to fight an enemy that's willing to die to kill you, right? I think the Americans in the Pacific Theater saw this with the kamikaze pilots, and this is something that greatly disturbed a lot of the soldiers, was that they were like, oh my god, these people are willing to, do these suicide bombings, essentially, just to kill us. This is insane. How do you defend against that? Because if you have an enemy that cares about their own life and staying alive while killing you, right, there's a lot more that you can do to defend yourself, right? You can threaten their life in order to prevent them from killing you. But if you have an enemy that does not care about his own life, and he just singularly cares about killing you, that really limits your options in terms of what you can do about it. And essentially, the whole mutually assured destruction policy assumes that you're dealing with an enemy that cares about their own life. It's kind of like that Sting song, like, the Russians love their children too, right? Which is, basically that's the basic assumption of mutually assured destruction. But increasingly in the world today, we see more and more instability, and there are just a lot of, terrorist groups out there that are willing to die to kill people. And so if a group like that were to get their hands on nuclear weapons, it could very easily be the end of the world, unless you had proper defense systems that weren't just psychological deterrents. And that's why I think that that's just a very important policy to put in place. Important thing to research, essentially, is to have these physical deterrents rather than psychological ones. So, yeah. All right, I'm going to take a drink of water. Okay. Also, I apologize about the stream freezing. I hope that's not too bad of an issue. I see a lot of stream health warnings, and I'm not quite sure why. I might be having Wi-Fi issues right now, but I am recording this, so if I watch it back and it looks too bad, I will just re-upload this as a video. So yeah, but I apologize for that in the meantime if that's looking too bad. Anyway, let's continue. All right. Okay, afternoon session, 2 p.m. Shall we resume? It is agreeable to Dr. Oppenheimer that the proceedings continue this afternoon without his presence. I just want to make it clear that it is a matter of his own choosing and not of Mr. Garrison that they are not present this afternoon for the remainder of these proceedings. That's correct. He may be back before we finish, but this is a matter of his own choosing. Okay, so it looks like Oppenheimer has left the chat. Okay. Okay. Would you proceed, Mr. Robb? And cross-examination by Mr. Robb. Dr. Rabi, you testified that in the fall of 1949, the problem of the super program had your attention quite considerably. Yes. And I believe you said that you talked with Dr. Lawrence and Dr. Alvarez about it. Yes. Could that have been in October, just before the meeting of the GAC? Oh, Dr. Oppenheimer entered the room. Okay. Well, he's back then. Okay, I don't know what he was doing. You're back now, Dr. Oppenheimer. This is one of the few things I'm really sure of. That's funny. I can't remember the exact date. I think it was in the fall. It was before the GAC meeting. Oh wait, sorry. Yeah, it was before the GAC meeting? I'm quite sure. Did Alvarez and Dr. Lawrence come to see you in New York? That's right. Together, or did they come separately? Together. What was the purpose of their visit to you, sir? Well, we are old friends. I don't remember what the purpose was that they wanted to come up, which I didn't find extraordinary. Physicists visit one another. Both are people I have known for a long time, but we did talk on this thing which was in our mind. Yes, to save time, didn't they come to see you with special reference to the thermonuclear question, or the super question? That may have been in their minds. It may have been in their minds. We got going on it right away. In all events, you talked about it. That's right. What was in their minds, I don't know. Do you recall what their views were on it as they expressed them to you then? Their views were that they were extremely optimistic. They are both very optimistic gentlemen. They were extremely optimistic about it. They had been to Los Alamos and talked to Dr. Teller, who gave them a very optimistic estimate about the thing and about the kind of special materials which would be required. So they were all keyed up to go bang into it. They thought we ought to go ahead with it. I think if they had known then what we knew a year later, I don't think they would have been so eager, but at that time they had a very optimistic estimate. To help you fix the time, was that after the Russian explosion? After the Russian explosion. Was that the main reason why they thought we ought to get along with the thermonuclear program? I don't know. Beg pardon? I would suppose so. As I testified before, what I testified was that we felt we had to do something to recover our lead. Did you express your own view to them on that subject? Yes, that we had to do something, and I think that I may have inclined. This is something which I kept no notes on. I understand, Doctor. Oh, sorry. I understand, Doctor. I think I may have inclined toward their view on the basis of the information they said they had from Dr. Teller. Did you find yourself in any substantial disagreement with their views as they expressed them? It wasn't the case of agreement or disagreement. I generally find myself, when I talk with these two gentlemen, in a very comfortable position. I like to be an enthusiast. I love it. But those fellows are so enthusiastic that I have to be conservative. So it always puts me in an odd position to say, now, no, they're there, and that sort of thing. So I was not in agreement in the sense that I felt they were as usual, which is, to their credit, they have accomplished very great things, overly optimistic. Except for that, you agreed with their thought that we ought to do something, as you put it, to regain our position. That's right. I felt very strongly. I spoke to everybody I could properly speak to, as I said earlier, talking about what we could do to get back this enormous lead which we had at the time. This, of course, was one of the possibilities. Was it before that or after that you talked to Dr. Oppenheimer? I really don't remember the sequence of events at that time, and when I saw Dr. Oppenheimer, whether he was away for the summer or I was or what, I wish I could testify. I don't keep a diary. I understand. All I want is your best recollection, Doctor. Whenever you talked to Dr. Oppenheimer, did he express his views on this matter? It's very hard to answer. I just don't recollect to tell you a specific time at a specific place where I spoke to Oppenheimer. May I help you a little bit? It's difficult to separate what he might have told you before the meeting with what he said at the meeting. To which meeting are you talking? The meeting of October 29. I don't really remember that we met before the meeting or immediately before the meeting, or that he told me something of that sort. I just don't remember. My actual recollection is that I learned the purpose of the meeting at the meeting, but I'm not certain. I just can't tell. At all events, the views expressed by Dr. Oppenheimer at the meeting were not in accord with those expressed to you by Alvarez and Lawrence, were they? No, the meeting was a very interesting one. It was a rather solemn meeting. I must say that Dr. Oppenheimer, as chairman of the meeting, always conducted himself in such a way as to elicit the opinions of the members and to stimulate the discussion. He's not one of those chairmen who sort of takes it their privilege to hold the floor. The very opposite. Generally, he might express his own view last, and very rarely in a strong fashion, but generally with considerable reservations. When he reported to the commission, it was always a miracle to the other members on the committee how he could summarize 3 days of discussions and give the proper weight to the opinion of every member, the proper shade, and it rarely happened that some member would speak up and say, "This isn't exactly what I meant." It was a rather miraculous performance. Doctor, as chairman of the GAC, do you have custody of the minutes of the GAC? In what sense do you mean, sir? Do I possess them in my office in New York? Yes, sir. No, sir. Where would those be? In the AEC building in our office. In all events, there were no minutes of this October 29th meeting. I don't think there were minutes. There was a report. Yes. When we got down to a sort of settled procedure, we had the minutes, but at the end of the meeting there was a verbal report from the chairman GAC to the chairman AEC, and then a written report summarizing certain conclusions and recommendations, and if there were differences of opinion, trying to give the proper shade and tone, telling the date of the next meeting, and, if we know, the kind of questions we would like to take up at the next meeting. Do you recall any mention at that meeting of October 29, 1949, of a communication from Dr. Seaborg about the problem under discussion? I can't recollect. I don't know. I might add, it would not have been very significant because my feeling is now that we came into the meeting without any clear ideas, that in the course of an extremely exhausting discussion to and fro, examining all the possibilities, we each became clearer as to what this thing meant. So anybody who didn't participate in the discussion wouldn't have gotten what we conceived at that time to be that kind of clarity. You said somebody from the Joint Chiefs came to talk to you. Do you remember who that was? As I remember it, I think it was General Bradley. You said your impression was that General Bradley was not very well briefed. On atomic energy, that's right. Doctor, whose business was it to brief General Bradley anyway? I suppose the Military Liaison Committee. I see. You mean between the AEC and the Joint Chiefs? Yes, that is the way of communication, I presume. Who was on that committee? That is a matter of record. I'm sorry, I can't remember who happened to be the chairman. The military personnel changed all the time. The chairman changed all the time. For the life of me, I can't remember at present who it was then. I have a note here, and I think I wrote it down in your exact language. Quote, if they had been well briefed, we would have been where we are now 3 or 4 years ago, end quote. Could you explain that to us? Sure. If they had been well briefed and understood what atomic weapons meant in the whole thing, the sort of thing that the new look is talking about, we would have put up the kind of factories which we have at Patacaw, and we are setting up in Iowa and at Savannah River, and the increase in facilities at Hanford and so on, and we would have gone to town and spent the kind of money earlier that we spent later. That's what I mean. Just at that point, you mean with respect to A-bombs, if I can refer to it that way. The materials are similar. So you had in mind also the thermonuclear? Yes, sir. Everything. You can design so that the materials which enter are more or less interchangeable. You can do that with that in mind. In fact, that is what was done. For clarity, you said Iowa. Did you mean Ohio? I meant Ohio. Thank you. Portsmouth. That's kind of funny. As a sidebar, I feel like I mix up Ohio and Iowa a lot. Just because they both 4 letters, start and end with a vowel. I don't know why, but sometimes I'll say Iowa when I mean Ohio. Anyway, okay. I meant Ohio. Thank you. Portsmouth. You spoke of a meeting at Princeton in 1951. Is that right? Yes. That was after Dr. Teller's discovery, if we may call it such, wasn't it? At that point, I wouldn't call it Dr. Teller's discovery. I think Dr. Teller had a very important part in it, but I would not make a personal attribution. I was not trying to decide that, but merely to identify it. It was after some discovery was made, which was extremely promising. Not discovery, invention. Invention, yes, sir. Was there any discussion at that meeting as to whether or not the President's directive to proceed with the thermonuclear permitted you to go ahead with the development of that invention? Do I make myself clear? No. Was there any discussion about whether or not you could go ahead with the work on that invention with the exploitation and development of it in the terms of the President's orders or directive? The only discussion, as I recall, sir, were the ways and means of going ahead, and how to get certain questions settled. There were certain technical questions of what would happen under certain circumstances in this design. It was amenable to theoretical calculations by some very good man. I think Dr. Betha went and did it. But there was no discussion about whether or not the terms of the President's directive permitted you to go to work on that invention. No, I don't recall any. It would be hard for me to see why there would have been. Doctor, I noticed this sentence in the report of the GAC of the October 29, 1949 meeting, which I am told I may read aloud. Quote, "It is the opinion of the majority that the super program itself should not be undertaken, and that the Commission and its contractors understood that construction of neutron-producing reactors is not intended as a step in the super program." End quote. Doctor, were the neutron-producing reactors to which you had reference there the same type that were constructed at Savannah? Yes, sir. They were constructed with that in mind. They were dual purpose. The design could be optimized in one direction or another direction, and a balance was made, as I remember. Is it appropriate to ask the doctor when they were constructed? Then Dr. Beckerly, I think that is a matter of public record. It is a matter of record, and I would not try to test my memory on that. In all events, when they were constructed with a view that they would be a step in the super program. That they could be a step in the super program. We were in a wonderful position. We could go one way or the other. Doctor, you said that the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, Junior Strauss, maybe Dr. Strauss? I don't know why it says Junior Strauss. I think Dr. Strauss, yeah. Doctor, you said that the chairman of the AEC, Dr. Strauss, in January of this year, had asked you to take a look at the FBI report which he had on Dr. Oppenheimer. Yes. Did you mean to say that he asked you to come to his office for that purpose? We talked about the case, of course. He informed me of the thing. Yes. He thought, as chairman of the General Advisory Committee, I ought to know the contents of that report. I think if I had asked for the full report, I would have gotten it. I may say that the record is not something I wanted to see. No, I understand that. In fact, I disliked the idea extremely of delving into the private affairs in this way of a friend of mine, but I was finally convinced that it was my duty to do so. Certainly. What I had in mind, Doctor, was that you did not mean to suggest that Mr. Strauss sent for you and said to you, in effect, "Look what I have now." Oh, no. I was sure of that. I was sure of that. No. Did you go to see him on that occasion on your own volition, or did he send for you? I go to see him every time I'm in Washington and spend an hour or two with him discussing all sorts of problems which refer to the GAC-AEC relations. I'm going to see him this afternoon if I get away from here in time. Certainly, Doctor. Don't answer this question unless you want to, but did you go to see Mr. Strauss on one occasion more or less in behalf of Dr. Oppenheimer? Just specially for that purpose? Well, among other purposes. You may have had other purposes. We've talked about this every time I met him. Yes, I can quite understand that. Yes, I've talked to Mr. Strauss on this certainly in behalf of Dr. Oppenheimer, but even more in behalf of the security of the United States. To tell you frankly, I have very grave misgivings as to the nature of this charge, still have, and the general public discussion which it has aroused, and the fear that as a result of such a discussion, important security information, absolutely vital to the United States, may be, bit by bit, inadvertently leaked out. I'm very much worried about that. Doctor, do you approve of Dr. Oppenheimer's course of giving the letter from General Nichols and his reply to the newspapers? I don't know his motives on that. In his position, I think I would have done the same thing. I just wanted to get your views on it. Yes. You said, sir, that you would rather not answer with respect to the matter of continental defense. No, I did not. May I finish my question? As to the difference in emphasis between you and Dr. Oppenheimer. No, sir, I don't recall I said that. Oh, wait. Yeah. I misunderstood you. It was a possible difference in emphasis of the method of employment of a strategic air force. I see. That is what I was trying to say. In the method of employment. In other words, this is a kind of military question and runs into problems of target selection, things of that sort. For that reason, since this is not just an AEC question for which I understand the members of this panel are cleared, but refers to DoD questions, I would rather not talk about it. In other words, you feel that would be classified information which you should not disclose even to the members of this board. That's right. I don't want to skirt around and maybe fall into something. I see. I think that's all I would like to ask, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Rabi, you mentioned this morning that at the October 1949 meeting of the GAC, General Bradley came, to the best of your recollection, and you said also there was a State Department man. Do you remember who that was? I think it was Mr. Kennan. I think it was Mr. Kennan. You mentioned a meeting at Los Alamos in the summer, I believe, of 1950. Yes. That was before the Princeton meeting, of course, to which you referred. Yes. Was Dr. Oppenheimer at the meeting in the summer of 1950? Yes, indeed. I don't remember exactly. The meeting, I think, was a meeting of the Subcommittee on Weapons. I think there were 3 subcommittees of the General Advisory Committee, which were sort of specialized. 1 weapons, 1 on reactor, and 1 on research. I think that was the Weapons Subcommittee. I don't recall the full attendance at that meeting, but Dr. Oppenheimer was there. With respect to the development of the H-bomb, I don't know how to refer to it exactly, but you know what I'm talking about, and the issue of who was for and who was against. Was it your impression that Dr. Oppenheimer was unalterably opposed to the development? No, I would not say so, because after we had those 2 statements, which were written by different groups, which were put in, I distinctly remember Dr. Oppenheimer saying he would be willing to sign both. My question was bad because unalterably is a pretty strong word, and you have already testified that subsequent to the President's decision, he encouraged the program and assisted in it. Yes, sir. So I think this was a bad question. I was really testifying as to that time that there were 2 statements of attitudes which differed, and he said, I was really testifying as to that time that there were 2 statements of attitudes which differed, and he said he would be ready to sign either or both. He would have been willing to sign the one which you signed? That Fermi and I did, yes. Would you have considered those 2 reports absolutely consistent? No. Yourself? No, I just answered your question about being unalterably opposed. There was a real difference. Yes, sir, there was a real difference. There was no difference as far as a crash program was concerned, that they thought was not in order. I have one other question. You testified very clearly, I think, as to your judgment of Dr. Oppenheimer as a man referring to his character, his loyalty to the United States, and to his friends and to institutions with which he might be identified, and made an observation about associations. As of today, would you expect Dr. Oppenheimer's loyalty to the country to take precedence over loyalty to an individual or to some other institution? I just don't think that anything is higher in his mind or heart than loyalty to his country. This sort of desire to see it grow and develop. I might amplify my other statement in this respect, and that is something we talked of through the years. When we first met in 1929, American physics was not really very much, certainly not consonant with the great size and wealth of the country. We were very much concerned with raising the level of American physics. We were sick and tired of going to Europe as learners. We wanted to be independent. I must say, I think that our generation, Dr. Oppenheimer's and my other friend that I can mention, did that job, and that 10 years later we were at the top of the heap, and it wasn't just because certain refugees came out of Germany, but because of what we did here. This was a conscious motivation. Oppenheimer set up this school of theoretical physics, which was a tremendous contribution. In fact, I don't know how we could have carried out the scientific part of the war without the contributions of the people who worked with Dr. Oppenheimer. They made their contributions very willingly and very enthusiastically and single-mindedly. Perhaps I could get at my question this way. You're familiar, if you have read the Nichols letter and read the summary of a file which Chairman Strauss handed you, with the Chevalier episode to some extent, I take it? I know of the episode, yes. Would you expect Dr. Oppenheimer today to follow the course of action he followed at the time in 1943? You mean refuse to give information. Is that what you mean? Yes. I certainly do. At the present time, I think he would clamp him into jail if he asked such a question. I'm sorry? At the present time, if a man came to him with a proposal like that, he would see that he goes to jail. At least that is my opinion of what he would do in answer to this hypothetical question. Do you feel that security is relative, that something that was all right in 1943 would not be all right in 1954? If a man in 1954 came with such a proposal, my God, it would be horrifying. Supposing a man came to you in 1943, I would have thrown him out. Would you have done anything more about it? I don't think so, unless I thought he was just a poor jackass and didn't know what he was doing. But I would try to find out what motivated him and what was behind it, and get after that at any time. If somebody asked me to violate a law and an oath, I hope you're not taking offense at my asking this question, but this is a perfectly serious question because you have testified without equivocation, I think, and in the highest possible terms of Dr. Oppenheimer's character, his loyalty, and with certain reservations about his early associations. As Mr. Marks pointed out in the question leading to this testimony, these are things which the Atomic Energy Act says must be taken into account in this matter of clearance. I trust you understand this is a very solemn duty that the board has been given. I certainly do, sir. There have been those who have testified that men of character and standing and loyalty, that this episode should simply be disregarded. I don't think that is an unfair summary of what some of the witnesses have said. Do you feel that this is just a matter that is of no consequence? I do not think any of it is of no consequence. I think you have to take the matter in its whole context. For example, there are men of unquestioned loyalty who do not know enough of the subject. I'm talking now of the atomic energy field, so that in their ordinary speech they don't know what they're saying. They might give away very important things. That would be true of me, I'm sure. It certainly has been true of a lot of military stuff that you see published. It makes your hair stand on end to see high officers say, and people in Congress say, some of the things they say. But with a man of Dr. Oppenheimer's knowledge, who knows the thing completely, and its implications, and its importance, and the different phases, believing as I do in his fundamental loyalty, I think to whomever he has talked, he would know how to stay completely clear of sensitive information. In any event, I think there is a very large distinction there. In any event, I believe you did testify that you would be quite convinced. I'm not sure you did. Are you quite convinced that as of today, Dr. Oppenheimer's course of action would be in accord with what you would do, rather than what he did in respect to the matter of this sort? I can't say what a man will do, but we only can apply subject the tests in these matters as far as your testimony as to character, loyalty, and so forth are concerned. So this is all subjective, but would you expect, without any real question in your mind, that today Dr. Oppenheimer would follow the kind of course that you would approve of today with respect to this matter? I think I can say that with certainty. I think there is no question in my mind of his loyalty in that way. You know, there always is a problem of that sort. I mean, the world has been divided into sheep and goats. I mean, the country has been divided into sheep and goats. There are the people who are cleared and those who are not cleared. The people against whom there has been some derogatory information and whatnot. What it may mean and so on is difficult. It is really a question in one's personal life. Should you refuse to enter a room in which a person is present against whom there is derogatory information? Of course, if you are extremely prudent and want your life circumscribed that way, no question would ever arise. If you feel that you want to live a more normal life and have confidence in your own integrity and in your record for integrity, then you might act more freely, but which could be criticized, either for being foolhardy or even worse. In one's normal course at a university, one does come across people who have been denied clearance. Should you never sit down and discuss scientific matters with them, although they have very interesting scientific things to say? No, I would not think so. That is the sort of question you are putting, Dr. Gray, and I'm answering to the best of my ability. I'm wondering whether it is, Dr. Rabi. Let me say this. I think there is not anybody who is prepared to testify that he can spot a communist with complete infallibility. I know that there have been people who surprised me that I had an acquaintanceship with who turned out to be communists. I don't think it is unfair to say that witnesses, including Dr. Oppenheimer himself, have testified that there were people who later turned out to be communists, to their surprise, who they identified. I'm asking against the background of the security of this country, which must be paramount, it seems to me, perhaps unhappily, to any other consideration or personal institution can we afford, to make it a matter of individual judgment as to whether a person is dangerous, in this case Mr. Chevalier. I don't know that he has ever appeared before any committee or anything else. I don't know whether he is a member of the Communist Party or not. It is conceivable that he might have been, I'm afraid. I'm making an argument now, but it is all a part of this question. Against what I believe to be the commitments involved in joining the Communist Party, can it be a matter of individual judgment whether it does no harm to either fail to report what seems to be an espionage attempt or to discuss in however clear terms information which is of a classified nature? That is the most confused question you ever had put to you, and I think I should eliminate the last part in any event because the Chevalier incident did not, as I understand it, involve disclosure of information. There was none of that involved. I don't want the record to make it appear that I'm implying that. This was simply a question of not taking immediate security precautions either in respect to reporting the incident, a later matter of declining to disclose the name of the man who made the approach, and certain other less frank aspects. I believe you said you did not know what was a proper course to follow, and you would expect Dr. Oppenheimer to follow a different course today. Yes. Which implies certainly, I think, that you think he should follow a different course today. I can't say anything, but yes, we have all learned a whole lot since that time. A lot of things which were quite different at one time, but different in another. You have to become accustomed to life in this kind of life when you are involved in this kind of information. You are saying that in your judgment, Dr. Oppenheimer has changed. He has learned. All right. I think he was always a loyal American. There was no doubt in my mind as to that. But he has learned more the way you have to live in the world as it is now. We hope at some future time that the carefree pre-war days will return. Dr. Rabi, would you tell us something about your early education? I'm a graduate of Manual Training High School in Brooklyn, a graduate of Cornell University with a degree of Bachelor in Chemistry. We are fellow chemists. I'm glad you had some chemistry. I had an awful lot of chemistry. Then I worked after that for a year in analytical laboratories, the Peace Laboratory, which were an affiliate of the Letterly Laboratories in New York, and then for various things for a few years. I went back to Cornell, I think it was in 1923, for graduate work in chemistry, but during the course of setting up my program, I decided to change to physics. I spent a year at Cornell in graduate work and then went to Columbia, where I transferred, where I took my doctor's degree in 1927. I'm older than Dr. Oppenheimer, but his degree, I think, is older than mine, or about the same vintage. During that period, I supported myself by instructing in physics at the College of the City of New York. Then I got a fellowship from Columbia and went to Europe to study theoretical physics, first at Munich and then to Copenhagen, and then to Hamburg. While there, I had an idea for an experimental problem and changed back to doing experimental physics. After my experiment was done, I went to Leipzig with Professor Heisenberg, back to theoretical physics, where I first met Dr. Oppenheimer briefly on his visit, and after Dr. Heisenberg went to the United States for a lecture tour, I went to Zurich, where Dr. Oppenheimer was working on Stellar, and we found ourselves sympathetic. At the end of that summer, I went to Columbia as a lecturer. At the end of that summer, I went to Columbia as a lecturer in physics. I have been at Columbia ever since, except for a 5-year period during the war. I enlisted is the wrong word. I left Columbia in November 1940 to join the radiation lab at MIT, which was concerned with the production of microwave radar, the research and development of microwave radar, and stayed there throughout the war. My connection with Los Alamos, I was never on their payroll, but went there as a radiation lab man. Let me ask you another question that has nothing particularly pertinent to this proceeding. Is George Pegram still active? Wonderfully. He's doing 2 men's work. He's 78, you know. Recently, he has had a heart attack. He is chairman of a committee which handles all the research contracts, which amount to many, many millions for the university. I think the record will have to show that he is a native North Carolinian. Yes, sir, a graduate of Trinity College. His father was professor of chemistry. I wish you would tell him that Dr. Evans asked about him. I would be delighted to. Now, another question. Were you, as a scientific man, particularly surprised when you heard that the Russians had fired a bomb, or would you have expected it? I was astonished that it came that soon. I will tell you this was a peculiar kind of psychology. If you had asked anybody in 1944 or 45 when would the Russians have it, it would have been 5 years. But every year that went by, you kept on saying 5 years. So although I was certain they would get it, you were certain they would get it? I was certain that they would get it, but it was a stunning shock. You would be pretty certain right now that they will get the thermonuclear. In time. What I'm afraid of is this controversy over this case may hasten the day because of the sort of attrition of the security of technical information, all sorts of stuff appearing in the newspapers and magazines, and so on, that sort of skirts around it. You know, you have a filter system for information. You put bits and pieces together. They already know something. If Fuchs transmitted the information, they have essentially the object which we were talking about in 1949, so they have a start, and if they can reconstruct our line of thinking, it's almost inevitable they will get it. I don't mind telling you, gentlemen, I'm very, very deeply concerned. You understand, of course, our position on this board, do you not? Yes, it's not your problem, but I think it's the problem of the government of the United States. Did you know that some of the people that were educated with Dr. Oppenheimer listened to his lectures and turned out to be communists? Educated with him? It was in that school that he conducted. You mean who studied with him? Yes. I've heard that, but I can't. This is not direct information. You've met some communists, have you, Dr. Rabi? I have met people who later said they were communists. At Los Alamos, I met Mr. Hawkins, who said he had been a communist, and this other chap, what is the name? I can't remember at this moment. I certainly knew Frank Oppenheimer from the time he was a kid in high school. You didn't meet any of those at the radiation lab, like Bernie Peters? I met Peters just fleetingly once or twice. I don't recall any actual conversation with Peters. Dr. Rabi, if you were approached by someone attempting to secure from you security information, would you report it immediately, or would you consider it for quite a long time? Are you talking about April 21, 1954? Oh, no. What date are you talking about? I'm talking about the Chevalier incident. What date was that? Late 1942 or early 1943. I would like to have the question, since this is a crucial question, put more fully so that I can answer the point rather than make up the question, so to speak. You are giving me a big job, aren't you? This is not child's play here. If you had been working on security material that had a high priority, and someone came to you and told you that they had a way of getting that material to the Russians, what would you have done immediately? You mean if it was just someone that I didn't know? No, someone that you knew. Suppose I was a friend of yours and I came and told you. And I thought that you were a completely innocent party or not. I think that is the nub of the question, what I would have done at the time. I can't say what I would have done at the time. I kind of think I would have gone after it and found out just what this was about. That is all. Alright, then we have redirect examination by Mr. Marks. And I'm gonna drink some water. Okay. Dr. Rabi, what do you mean you would have gone after it and found out what this was about? I would have tried to see what the proper I would have tried to see that the proper authorities found out what these people meant to do, what the thing was. I know a number of times during the war I heard funny noises in my telephone and got the security officers after it. Dr. Rabi, Mr. Robb asked you whether you had spoken to Chairman Strauss in behalf of Dr. Oppenheimer. Did you mean to suggest in your reply to him, you said you did, among other things, did you mean to suggest that you had done that at Dr. Oppenheimer's instigation? No, I had no communication from Dr. Oppenheimer before these charges were filed, or since, except that I called him once to just say that I believed in him with no further discussion. Another time I called on him and his attorney at the suggestion of Mr. Strauss. I never hid my opinion from Mr. Strauss that I thought that this whole proceeding was a most fortunate one. What was that? That the suspension of the clearance of Dr. Oppenheimer was a very unfortunate thing and should not have been done. In other words, there he was. He is a consultant, and if you don't want to consult the guy, you don't consult him, period. Why you have to then proceed to suspend clearance and go through all this sort of thing, he is only there when called, and that is all there was to it. So it didn't seem to me the sort of thing that called for this kind of proceeding at all against a man who had accomplished what Dr. Oppenheimer has accomplished. There is a real positive record, the way I expressed it to a friend of mine. We have an A-bomb and a whole series of it. And we have a whole series of super bombs, and what more do you want, mermaids? This is just a tremendous achievement. If the end of that road is the kind of hearing which can't help but be humiliating, I thought it was a pretty bad show. I still think so. Dr. Rabi, in response to a question of the chairman, the substance of which I believe was Dr. Oppenheimer unalterably opposed to the H-bomb development at the time of the October 1949 GAC meeting. I think you said in substance no, and then you added, by way of explanation immediately after, the two annexes, or whatever they were. During the discussion, he said he would be willing to sign either or both. Can you explain what you meant by that rather paradoxical statement? No, I was just reporting a recollection. What impression did you have? What it means to me is that he was not unalterably opposed, but on some, adding up everything, he thought it would have been a mistake at that time to proceed with a crash program, with all that entailed, with this object that we didn't understand, when we had an awfully good program on hand in the fission field, which we did not wish to jeopardize. At least, we did not feel it should be jeopardized. It turned out, in the events, that both could be done. Los Alamos just simply rose to the occasion and worked miracles. Absolute miracles. That's all. Then we have Recross examination by Mr. Robb. Doctor, on the occasion when you were in Mr. Strauss's office and he showed you the report that you testified about, how long would you say that meeting lasted? I can't remember. A few minutes? I don't know whether it was a few minutes or half an hour. If you were Mr. Strauss, there are calls coming in all the time from all over, from the White House and whatnot. Did you look at the report in Mr. Strauss's office? No, I put it in an envelope and went to our GAC office. I read it there, and then brought it back. Dr. Rabi, getting back to the hypothetical questions that have been put to you by the chairman and Dr. Evans about the Chevalier incident, if you had been put in that hypothetical position and had reported the matter to an intelligence officer, you of course would have told the whole truth about it, wouldn't you? I'm naturally a truthful person. You would not have lied about it. I'm telling you what I think now. The Lord alone knows what I would have done at that time. This is what I think now. Of course, Doctor, as you say, only God knows what is in a man's mind and heart, but give us your best judgment of what you would do. This is what I think now. I hope that is what I would have done then. In other words, I take a serious view of that. I think it is crucial. You say what? I take a serious view of that incident, but I don't think it is crucial. Of course, Doctor. You don't know what Dr. Oppenheimer's testimony before this board about that incident may have been, do you? No. So perhaps in respect of passing judgment on that incident, the board may be in a better position to judge than you. I have the highest respect for the board. I'm not going to make any comments about the board. They are working very hard, as I have seen. Of course, I realize you have complete confidence in the board, but my point is that perhaps the board may be in possession of information which is not now available to you about the incident. It may be. On the other hand, I am in possession of a long experience with this man, going back to 1929, which is 25 years, and there is a kind of seat of the pants feeling which I myself lay great weight. In other words, I might even venture to differ from the judgment of the board without impugning their integrity at all. I'm confining my question to that one incident, Doctor. I think we have agreed that the board may be in possession of information from Dr. Oppenheimer's own lips about that incident which is not now available to you, is that correct? This is a statement? Yes. I accept your statement. And therefore it may well be that the board is now in a better position than you, so far as that incident is concerned, to evaluate it. An incident of that sort they may be. I can't say they are not. But on the other hand, I think that any incident in a man's line of something of that sort, you have to take it in sum. Of course. You have to take the whole story. Of course. That is what novels are about. There is a dramatic moment, and the history of man... That is what novels are about. There is a dramatic moment, and the history of the man, what made him act, what he did, and what sort of person he was. That is what you are really doing here. You are writing a man's life. Of course, but as a scientist, Doctor, and evaluating, we will say, an explosion, you perhaps would be in a better position to evaluate an explosion, having witnessed it and having first-hand knowledge about it, than somebody who had not, is that right? If you put it in that way, I don't know the trend of your question. I'm not fencing with you. I really want to know what you're getting at. I'm not fencing with you either. If you're saying that an eyewitness to something can give a better account of it than a historian, that I don't know. Historians would deny it. It is a semantic question, but if you want to be specific about it, I will put it this way. As a scientist, you would say that one having all the facts about a particular physical manifestation or reaction would be in a better position to evaluate that than somebody who did not have all of the facts or might not know one of the facts. A lot of the things about this are not the sort of things which you term just facts. We have Mr. Morgan here, for example, who has been the head of a big business which he built up. He gets as many facts as possible, but I'm sure beyond that there is a lot of experience and color which makes his judgment. In a court of law, it might be something else. Ultimately, you go to a jury who have facts, and then they add a whole lot of things which your heart identifies as facts and their experience in life to a situation. I was afraid your question was tending to put me in the position of a so-called fiction scientist who looks at certain facts and measurements, and we are not talking about such a situation. Let me get back again to the concrete. Would you agree, Doctor, that in evaluating the Chevalier incident, one should consider what Dr. Oppenheimer says happened in that incident together with the testimony of persons such as yourself? Wait a minute. I didn't testify to that incident because I have only heard about it. Together with testimony of persons such as yourself about Dr. Oppenheimer. Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. Very well. Therefore, one who had heard Dr. Oppenheimer describe the incident and had heard your testimony would be in a better position to evaluate it than one who had not heard Dr. Oppenheimer describe it. Is that correct? I will put it this way. I think this committee is going into this, and they will be in as good as position as it is humanly possible to be for people who have never met this man before to make a judgment about it. I certainly resolved the right to my own opinion on this because I am in the possession of a long period of association with all sorts of minute reactions. I have seen his mind work. I have seen his sentiments develop. For example, I have seen in the last few years something which surprised me, a certain tendency of Dr. Oppenheimer to be inclined toward a preventive war. Nothing went all the way, but talking and thinking about it quite seriously. I have to add everything of that sort, all sorts of color, and form my own opinion. But I'm not on this board, and I think this board is trying to do what it can in this business of getting testimony, the kind of people to come to talk to them, the evaluation of the people and the kind of insight, whether they are just loyal people or whether they have thought about the problem and so on. It is a tough job, but nevertheless, I say I will stick to my right to have my own opinion. Certainly, Doctor. To sum up, I suggest to you what I did to Dr. Conant, and he agreed, that in deciding about a matter such as the Chevalier incident, one must consider all the available relevant evidence. Is that right? Certainly. And that would include what actually happened and what people such as yourself, who know Dr. Oppenheimer, say about Dr. Oppenheimer. You are talking about the job of the committee. Yes. Yes. Thank you, Doctor. Do you have any more questions? I think I better ask one more question, if the board will indulge me. Dr. Rabi, in view of the quite serious questions which quite properly have been asked you in regard to this so-called Chevalier episode, I would like to try to summarize for you what I understand the testimony to be, and ask you how that would affect the opinions you have expressed. As I understand the testimony, It is that Chevalier, who was an old friend of Dr. Oppenheimer, a member of the faculty in Romance languages at the University of California, was at his house on an occasion in the early part of 1943, and at that time Dr. Oppenheimer found himself at one point in the visit alone with Dr. Chevalier, who said that he understood from Eltiton that Eltiton had a way of getting information to the Russians. I think it is fair to say that the testimony is that Dr. Oppenheimer reacted emphatically in rejecting as wrong any consideration of such a matter, and used very strong language to Chevalier, and that Oppenheimer was thereafter convinced that Chevalier had entirely dropped the matter. Some months later, after Los Alamos had been set up and Dr. Oppenheimer was there as director, the security officer Lansdale mentioned to Oppenheimer that there was trouble of some kind at Berkeley. The indication was that some of the young physicists had committed indiscretions. On the occasion of Dr. Oppenheimer's next visit to Berkeley, he sought out the security officers there, told them that he understood that there was trouble of some kind, said that he thought that a man Eltiton would bear watching. The next day, the security officers asked Oppenheimer to talk to them further about the incident. At that time, they asked him to explain the circumstances which had moved him to suggest the name Eltiton. Dr. Oppenheimer said that there had been an intermediary. The security officers asked him to name the intermediary. He declined to do so. The security officers asked him whom the intermediary had approached. Oppenheimer said people on the project, and in the course of a long interview, it appears that they suggested there were 2 or 3 such people. He did not name himself or Chevalier as the people concerned. In the course of a long conversation at that time with the security officers, he mentioned also that a man at the Soviet consulate was involved, and there was some reference to microfilm, although the transcript of the conference between Oppenheimer and the security officers is not clear as to the context in which microfilms were mentioned. Later, Colonel Lansdale, a few weeks later, again interviewed Oppenheimer and asked him to name the intermediary. Oppenheimer again declined, and on all of these occasions he gave his explanation that he didn't want people to get in trouble who had acted properly and innocently, that he thought he was revealing the name of the only person who could possibly be guilty of real wrongdoing. Sometime after he refused to give the true story to Lansdale or give the names to Lansdale, General Groves talked to him and asked him to name the intermediary. On that occasion, Oppenheimer said, quote, "I won't give you the names unless you order me to," end quote. Groves said, quote, "I don't want to order you to. Think about it," end quote. Shortly after that, Groves again came to Oppenheimer and said, quote, "I need to have the name. If you don't give it to me, I will have to order you to," end quote. And at that time, Oppenheimer gave the name of Chevalier as the intermediary. In the course of questioning Dr. Oppenheimer about these circumstances, counsel for the board put the question to him whether the story that he had told the security officers on the occasion of the interview that I have described at Berkeley wasn't a fabrication and a tissue of lies, and to this I think Oppenheimer responded, "Right." Right it was. He accepted counsel's characterization. I may say that this occurred in the course of a very thorough cross-examination. "Have you finished, Mr. Marks?" "Yes." "Mr. Chairman, that was a rather long question." "I was about to ask a question." "I thought you were finished. It was a rather long statement, and I don't want the record to show that I am accepting as a completely accurate statement the entire circumstances, but of course I am not going to object to it. I have not objected to any question, and I don't intend to." "Certainly it will be obvious in the record that this was stated as Mr. Marks's summary." "Yes, certainly." "On that basis, he will now ask the question." "Certainly. I'm sure Mr. Marks understands." "I understand perfectly." "That was not the question." "No, it wasn't. I thought Mr. Robb wished to make a correction." "I understand exactly your point, Mr. Robb." "I ask you, Dr. Rabi, whether this account of my impression of the essentials of what has been brought out here leads you to wish to express any further comment." "The only comment I can make on this right off is that it is part and parcel of the kind of foolish behavior that occurred in the early part of the record, that there were very strong personal loyalties there, and I take it in mentioning Elton, he felt he had discharged his full obligation. My comment is that it was a very foolish action, but I would not put a sinister implication to it. The record is full of actions before Oppenheimer became the sort of statesman he is now of that sort of thing. Are you confident or are you not confident, Dr. Rabi? Whatever it is, let me put it this way. Are you confident that Dr. Oppenheimer would not make the kind of mistake again? I certainly am. He is a man who learns with extraordinary rapidity. Would you agree that incident involved a conflict in loyalties? The question is whether, to my mind, whether it involved a conflict of loyalties within his own heart. I don't think it did in his own heart, at least from what you tell me, and taking the sum total. Apparently, Chevalier was a man of whom he was very fond personally. They shared a mutual interest, I presume, of French literature. I don't think I have met the gentleman. By pointing the finger at Elton, I think he felt that he had done the necessary thing for the protection of security. I think if he thought about it more profoundly at the time, and were not so tremendously occupied and burdened by the Los Alamos problems, he might have been that, and this was certainly something that he could not hope to keep quiet. It was a great mistake in judgment, and everything else. He should have swallowed that bitter pill at once, but I read no sinister implication in it. Would you be confident, or would you not be confident, that today he would resolve the question of his responsibility on the one hand to the country or the public in a way that you would? I think he would be very conscious of his position not to impair his usefulness to the United States. Even though he might not have shared certain fears, he would not have taken that particular responsibility of withholding that information and have run that particular personal danger of doing it. I think he is just a much more mature person than he was then. That's all. May I ask one more question? This is a purely hypothetical question, Doctor. I just want to get your reaction to it. Suppose on all the evidence this board should not be satisfied that Dr. Oppenheimer in his testimony here has told this board the whole truth. What would you say then about whether or not he ought to be cleared? It depends on the nature of the sort of thing he withheld. There may be elements of one's private life that do not concern this board or anybody else. Suppose the board should not be satisfied that he had told the truth or the whole truth about some material matter. What would you say then? It would again depend on the nature of the material matter. If I agreed that the matter was material and germane to this, then I would be very sorry. What? I would be very sorry. You mean you would feel that they could not clear him? I feel it would be a very tough question. Wouldn't you feel that they couldn't clear him, or would you rather not answer that? It's the sort of hypothetical question which to me goes under the terms of a rather meaningless question. With all due respect, in the sense that I want to know the material fact, and I would want the reason we don't have an individual but a board, is that I would want to discuss it with others to help bring out our own feelings and so forth. Certainly. So therefore, I feel that to answer a hypothetical question in this way, without putting myself into the position as a member of the board and what would be the outcome of my discussions and weighing of this thing with the other members of the board, I think an answer to that sort of thing is something I could not give, because I haven't got the circumstances under which to answer it. But the circumstances might be such: if you want to set me up on the board, then I would come out with an answer. No, let me ask you one more question. The circumstances might be such that you would feel that the board should not clear him if that happened? There certainly are circumstances which I can picture where the board could not clear him. You know, the sort of evidence that Thoreau refers to of finding a trout in the milk. I'm pretty sure it is adultery. I'm not saying there is no evidence where I would be doubtful. I would rather be more specific about it. I'm sure that Dr. Rabi understands that this board has reached no conclusion. The board has no view or position and will reach none until the hearings are concluded. I'm not suggesting that counsel's question was improper. I wish, however, to say for the record that it clearly is a hypothetical question. That is why I prefaced it by saying it was hypothetical. I know you did. I know you didn't intend to lead Dr. Rabi to the conclusion that the board had reached a conclusion on anything. I don't mind counsel giving their view of the testimony on either side. I do object to anything that suggests that this board has reached any kind of conclusion. Of course I had no such intention. That is why I prefaced my question by saying this is indeed a hypothetical question. I think that's all, Doctor. Thank you. We can now thank you very much, Dr. Rabi. Thank you. All right, witness excused. Does that conclude your witness for today? Yes. We will recess until 9:30. Could we make it 10? I would be glad to talk to the board about it. My inclination is against it. I'm sorry, I would like to accommodate you, but the board feels we should start at 9:30. Thereupon, at 3:25 p.m., a recess was taken until Thursday, April 22nd, 1954, at 9:30 a.m. So, yeah, that's it. That's kind of funny at the end there. We got to start at 9:30. We cannot wait until 10. I don't know why they feel so strongly about that. But yeah. Anyway, yeah, that was some really interesting testimony from Dr. Rabi. I mean, he is another major figure in the history of nuclear physics, very close associate of Dr. Oppenheimer, personal friend. So, yeah, it was interesting to read through his testimony, especially about his opinions on continental defense as, you know, necessary as a deterrent and as a defense for nuclear warfare. But yeah, that's about it. So I will be back, you know, either next week or in 2 weeks, something like that, on Friday to start on the next transcript, Transcript 9. And yeah, it's been really interesting so far. I think it will continue to be interesting. We're only about halfway through these hearings, actually. So if you look at the calendar down here, or up in the middle, you can see that there's 2 whole weeks left. So lots and lots and lots of content left. Yeah. But yeah, so also, just like in other news, I guess, as I said, look out for my books coming out soon. My next book, I am currently working on the cover, and I am getting very close to finishing that, so look out for some sort of announcement to see the cover art of my next book in the next week or two. I think it will look very cool, and I think you'll like it. It's made in Blender, the 3D rendering software. It's like a DNA molecule model. It's pretty cool, I think. So yeah, that's about all I have to say for today. Thank you for watching, and I apologize again for any interruptions due to Wi-Fi issues. So I might have to re-upload this as a video rather than a live stream. So yeah. But yeah, that's about it. Thank you all for watching, and goodbye.